In the 5 years since the global recession began, our economy has seen great changes. Some suggest the capitalist system that has brought so much prosperity in the world is in some kind of crisis. Beyond that, they say capitalism is unjust. Joining me now, two people making some of these arguments. David Harvey is a geographer. His latest book is called Rebel Cities, From the Right to the City to the Urban Revolution. Richard Wolff is an economist. His book is Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. I am pleased to have them at this table. Let's begin with the idea of why cities are so important.
I think a lot of money goes into building cities. A lot of people work and live and have their daily lives in cities. Half of the world's population, more than half now, lives in cities. Yeah. So you've really got to think about qualities of urban life as being absolutely crucial to contemporary life.
But beyond that, I mean, are cities somehow representing today some sense of the best of our civilization?
I think they're representing in some ways the worst of our civilization.
But is your argument then against capitalism and the distribution of wealth, and you simply choose cities as the venue to look at the issue?
I think it's partly a good venue to look at the cities because you see the inequality actually written into the urban landscape as you walk around. Or if you walk around. I mean, I love to walk around cities. Most people don't walk around them anymore, but I walk all over the place. And I think that this inequality, of course, stems from the inequalities which are inherent in a capitalist system. So the capitalist system produces certain kinds of cities. So you cannot change the cities without changing the capitalist system, and vice versa.
And what are your do you have any sense of optimism that something will change that make this equation different?
There are a lot of social movements going on in various cities around the world right now, which is why I wrote this book, is to talk about some of those social movements and what their vision is and what they might be doing. And there's a lot to be pulled together in terms of the kind of imaginary they have. If you're in Argentina and you're in neighborhoods where there's a neighborhood organization, or you're in Chile and you're seeing the student movement or on the streets fighting with the water cannon and all that kind of stuff, there's lots of movements trying to change urban life. And I think that this is something that's very exciting. On the other hand, when you look at the immense power and the military apparatus and the increasing militarization of cities, you get very nervous about the fact they will not be able to do much.
Are they gaining traction?
They are gaining traction. I think they're gaining in people understanding what might need to change in order to make for a decent urban life for everyone.
Occupy, the economy challenging capitalism. What's going on there?
Well, I think that what's coming to an end, to start with the good news, is a 50-year taboo in the United States about questioning our economic system. I mean, we take pride as Americans that we question and debate our education system, our transportation system. For the last couple of years, we have been debating our medical insurance and medical care system. But for 50 years at least, when it comes to the capitalist system, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, cheerleading is the substitute for serious question, for serious debate.
Tell me what Occupy wants.
What has struck me about them are two things, above all else. First, that they demonstrated to the world and to the American people that a critical stance towards the status quo, a desire to make fundamental change, can enroll hundreds of thousands and millions of people in a terribly short amount of time, can generate vast sympathy across this society when a lot of people did not think that was possible, or at least not in the offing for decades to come. And the second thing that they proved, besides that there is movement and there is desire for change, was they had an incredibly courageous position they took, which refers to what I just said. They put capitalism, the economic system, squarely in the center of the questions they wanted to address.
And some argued that was the wrong place to go.
Right.
As you know. They said, don't go to Wall Street, go to Washington.
And that's why I like what they did, because I don't agree with that. We are a strange country. In our country, when you have an economic problem, most of our people leap right over the economic players and go after the politicians. I like to point out that over the last crisis years now, 5 years, we have laid off something on the order of 8 to 10 or more millions of people from their jobs. The overwhelming majority of those people lost their jobs because a private capitalist employer told them to stay home. And if you look at the millions who've lost their homes, it's a private capitalist bank that did that. Where is then the criticism focused? It jumps over the corporation that fired you, over the bank that foreclosed you, and goes after the politician. If I were the head of a bank or if I were the head of a corporation, I'd be very pleased with that.
Okay, but have they outlined exactly what they want?
No, because that's being argued and discussed in them.
So
for most people involved,
meaning it hasn't been decided.
Hasn't been decided.
Okay,
it's being discussed, but you're right, it's being discussed. But remember, we haven't had a broad-based movement in this country fundamentally questioning capitalism in a long time.
Why not?
Well, I think we were successful, not the we that I'm a part of, but in the society was successful in creating that taboo, in making the question of criticizing capitalism either a sign that you weren't well educated, or that you didn't understand how things worked, or worst of all, that you were somehow disloyal to the United States by raising questions about its system. And that was done, and a culture was developed in which it became very difficult, very dangerous personally, to your career, to your even your functioning as a citizen, to do that kind of questioning. And breaking that up, that taboo, opening the space for debate, is probably the long-term historical debt we owe to the Occupy movement for having taken us a quantum leap forward.
Where do you come in?
It's not only a taboo, it's a power relation. I mean, one of the things Occupy did was to point out the power of Wall Street over politics, the power of Wall Street over the media, the fact that actually...
Wall Street over Congress.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, as Mark Twain said, you have the best Congress that money can buy, and we have it, you know. And I like to think there's a party of Wall Street which is deeply implanted both in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party. And you have almost, you know, a power structure. So I think one of the things that Occupy did was to say, how can you have a debate when the power structures are stuck in such a way that there's no space for a debate? And that even came down to a physical space. What struck me about the Occupy Wall Street, where are the public spaces in which the public can assemble and discuss these things? You know, and you had to go to private spaces like Zuccotti Park. In London, they wanted to go to Paternoster Square, and they found that Paternoster Square is in private ownership, so they had to go to the steps of St. Paul's. And you kind of realise there are no public spaces in the city where you can assemble and have a discussion about these things. And so when they started to have assemblies in these spaces, then you start to get police power saying you can't do this, you can't do this, and you can't do that. So I think the Occupy Wall Street problematized all sorts of things about the power relation, who controls the city, who controls the public spaces in the city, you know, who can get into Bryant Park and who can't, who can go, you know, who can go into Central Park and who can't.
Before Occupy, would you have said though it was wrong to have rules and questions that may be determined for either safety or for any one of another reasons?
Look,
that people...
my joke about this is increasingly what you have is a policy towards public space, which is to turn it into places where there's okay for an assembly of tulips, but not of people. Okay,
yes.
And so actually,
okay to grow things and look pretty.
And all the tulips there are going nodding their heads and looking very nice, you know, and you kind of go, if you want to have an assembly of people, the police come and tell you can't be here in this number. You know, you've got to get a permission from somebody. And at some point or other, you've got to say, we have to open up spaces in the city where we can have these discussions, because we can't have it in the media because, you know, it's difficult.
But is there any time in which a public demonstration somehow affects the rights of others?
Well, of course it always affects the rights of others, but then that's always going to be contested in some way. And I think that what we see now are rules which are set in motion, which give the power to groups which are not necessarily sympathetic. For example, I didn't see the Tea Party meetings being policed in exactly the same way that Occupy Wall Street was policed. Now, why is that? You ask yourself. Well,
there weren't many Tea Party meetings in New York City, by the way.
Not in New York City, but you didn't see the sort of hostile reaction you saw to it, and I think this is true in other cities, and you see this now, of course, occurring, and we've seen the same thing happening in Cairo, in Tahrir Square. Right. We've seen the Indignados in Spain. We've seen in Syntagma Square in
your point about what happened in Tahrir Square is what? That there were demonstrations that were being held and no one felt necessary to restrain them?
No, I think what happened was
because they had terrible acts of violence at the beginning, as you remember.
People took a public space and turned it into something which was a political space.
An assembly.
An assembly.
And assemble too.
Yes, and this was I think one of the key things that began to happen. That therefore, if there's a public sphere, you have to have spaces in which the public sphere can express itself. And we find that actually most of our cities are now designed to deny that. And I think again, Occupy did something which is very, very significant.
There's also this question which comes up, and it's come up in the campaign, and you've seen columns written about it, in which they say that President Obama wants to turn America into Europe. What do you think that criticism is about?
I think that's a thinly veiled effort to accuse Mr. Obama of being, in some sense, a social democrat, a socialist, the words that are often found in Europe to describe their general welfare state type of economies.
Yeah, but is a state that you want to create a welfare state?
No.
It is what?
The state I want to create is one that has faced up to and become willing to organize the production of goods and services that we all depend on in a fundamentally different way. Because for me, that's the root problem that we haven't faced, that we haven't debated, and that we don't change.
Well, is the best living example of that Norway or somewhere in Scandinavia, or where is it?
Well, you have efforts like this that have been existing inside and around capitalism from the beginning. They have funny names that we are maybe not used to.
But where have they taken hold?
Well, I'll give you one example, but let me mention them. One is the cooperative, one is the community enterprise, one is the collective enterprise. But the example that most these days is brought to the fore is an enterprise in the north of Spain called Mondragon, based in a little village or town in the north of Spain called Mondragon. And it is a story a little bit like your yogurt producer, only on a much bigger scale. Right. A Catholic priest in that part of Spain got together a handful of workers in the mid-1950s and said, because the unemployment is here so terrible, because the government doesn't care about most working people without work, let's start by building cooperatives, groups. Well, here we are, 50-odd years later. They have 85,000 member workers in the Mondragon Corporation who work in, cooperative enterprises, a whole range of them, from high-tech to low-tech, agriculture to industry, stunningly successful, a rate of growth that would be the envy of anyone. They're the largest corporation in northern Spain now, and they're one of the 10 largest corporations in Spain as a whole, which is no mean feat because Spain is an important country. So here's an example where competing with capitalists, they have organized differently. In each enterprise, the workers collectively meet and make the decision who to hire as the boss, what to pay him, what to do. It's a radical alternative. And it should be debated.
Indeed.
The other crucial thing about them is, until recently, the rate of return of the individual within the cooperative was 3-to-1 at most. And that meant that the highest earning person only got 3 times as much as the least earning.
As in America, where there's huge gap between the workers and the CEO.
It's 500 to 1 or something in this country, and they're at 3-to-1. And you wonder what kind of world we'd be living in if all enterprises everywhere worked on the principle of a 3-to-1 inequality. Then you'd have very different kinds of cities, very different kinds of transactions between people. You wouldn't have a situation like, for instance, in New York City, the top 1% earn something like $3.57 million a year, whereas 50% of the population is trying to get by on $30,000 a year. That level of inequality would be impossible in a world that was dominated by Mondragon-type cooperatives.
Because if workers together, that's very American. If workers as a community, if we recognize the community of people who work in an enterprise to make it work, if that community sat around collectively deciding how to pay its members, would they make some people multimillionaires and other people unable to take care of their kids barely or to have an education? The chances are extraordinarily unlikely.
I think there's a lot of support for the kind of thing that Rick is talking about when it's allowed to flourish. I think this comes back to the question of who controls the conversation about what might be possible And to the degree that all, everything is now filtered through this tremendous kind of monopoly power in the media, we're finding even in universities, we can't have a conversation about many of these things inside of universities anymore because there's a kind of orthodoxy which is taught, in economics departments and all the rest of it, and so you can't have this conversation. But when something happens...
You cannot have this conversation in a university?
No, it's very hard to have this conversation.
Yeah. Well, who says no?
The faculty and the whole spirit and the whole culture of the place.
Can you study Karl Marx at universities in
That was
America?
my point. No, I was never assigned one word of the mature Marx's economic critique, which is encapsulated in 3 volumes of Capital. Not at Harvard, not at Stanford, and not at Yale.
Not assigned. Suppose you wanted to write whatever, a thesis, a dissertation, on the ideas of Karl Marx. Would somebody say that's unacceptable?
Absolutely.
At Harvard, Yale, and Stanford.
Absolutely, because that happened to me. I went at Yale, which is where I got my PhD in economics. I went to them and I proposed that I wanted to do a dissertation on the colonial economic system as it pertained in East Africa, the British in a country now called Kenya. It used to be called the East Africa Protectorate.
Right.
I went to them and I said that, and professors' names will remain unmentioned, and they said to me, colonialism and the Marxist approach are not appropriate titles for a dissertation. And so if you look me up in the Yale
Did
archive,
they say that for what reason?
They didn't have to. It wasn't appropriate. It's almost as if
I
I
didn't
had...
think it wasn't appropriate because of any particular reason they said. Not appropriate because we think that it's an inaccurate description of the reality you want to pursue?
If I had pushed them, they might have said that.
Yeah, exactly.
I think you're dealing here with the lingering, long-lasting effects of McCarthyism.
Really?
Yeah. And
You really
the
do.
witch hunt. Yeah, I think it.
And
is
who are the
continued.
McCarthyites of this debate?
I think they're no longer. I mean, in a sense, McCarthy won by expelling this conversation from universities.
In the end, he did not win. McCarthy did not win in the end.
Well, I'm not so sure. I think we're now in a situation where still it's the case that who reads Marx in this country, for example?
My professors were not worried that they would be arrested or intimidated. No, it's more subtle. It's the consensus of the profession is that you don't do that. That's why we weren't assigned the work to read. That's why it wasn't discussed in the classroom. That's why we had to do it entirely on our own. It's just, that's why I use the word taboo. It's something that appropriately trained, well-schooled professors and graduate students don't deal with.
Is there a state that represents the values, that you would like to see reflected in the United States in terms of its economic system?
I think there are, if you like, pockets of activity.
So this is true around the world. Then
Yes.
it's not just the United States that you're thinking. That,
Absolutely.
And I think for some years, for example, there's an Indian state, Kerala,
yeah.
which has not had very good economic development from a capitalist standpoint. But on the other hand, it has superior education, it has great health care. It's done many of these, the population there is not wealthy, but on the other hand,
what would you say, for example, of Cuba?
Well, Cuba's, again, you have to look at the whole history of Cuba. There are a lot of problems there, but it's still the case that infant mortality in Cuba is lower than it is in many inner cities of the United States.
Right.
The educational levels are much higher than elsewhere in Latin America.
So could you go from that point to the point that Cuba has a better economic system than the United States, when in fact it was significantly being supported by, as you know, by the Soviet Union.
Right. I don't think it necessarily has a significant. I think there are serious economic problems that they should have worked out in a different kind of way.
And individual freedom problems and human rights problems and
human rights problems.
Discrimination
Although
against gays
you say,
others.
Human rights problems are interesting. I mean, if you sort of say, well, what are the human rights of people living around, say, the Johns Hopkins University Hospital.
Right.
In Baltimore, which has the lowest life expectancy of any
fair enough.
Kind of say, what's their human rights?
But are they being put in prison for their political beliefs?
No. But on the other hand, they die early. I mean, so you can check that one against the other. I'm not a great defender of the Cuban system.
I'm just looking for a system because sometimes people do look at Cuba and cite the two things that you did.
Yeah,
education,
education,
and childhood nutrition,
healthcare, and childhood nutrition.
Yeah.
But
I think what it ought to be done, and what ought to be part of the debate in politics, as well as in other forum, it is the notion of what are we learning from our experiences? Whether it's a subprime crisis, whether it's a sovereign debt crisis, and what is it telling us about sort of the future and what we ought to know? I mean, it raises basic questions about the regulation of capitalism.
Mm-hmm. When the credit system in the United States collapsed late in 2008, who led the charge to the government to come in and bail everybody out? The same corporate executives, whether they be from GM or Citibank or Morgan Stanley, who would have been giving speeches up until the last minute about how who needs the government should be minimal. It wasn't leftists or radicals or Marxists who brought the government in. It was the leaders of industry who understood that they had reached a dead end. Without the government, there was no hope, and they became the greatest enthusiasts for massive government intervention.
Without a bailout, it would have been over.
That was their view. And in many ways...
it's not just their view, it was a lot of people's view.
A lot of people's view. And it's probably true.
Yeah.
And so we bailed them out. They said,
that was the operative reason for the bailout.
Right. And they said...
the system would collapse.
Right. But the question is, do you avoid system collapse with that kind of a bailout that makes no fundamental changes? So that we look now at a story then that these banks were too big to fail. And without exception, they're bigger now than they were at the time that we said that. This is a society that's spinning out of control when it does such glaringly contradictory things, and we all know it, and nothing happens. It's as if we're the deer caught in the headlights of a process of breakdown that no one seems to be able to get a handle on, and I think it's because we're afraid to ask those basic questions that someone like Marx and others were the ones who wanted us to ask long ago.
I had a quote from you.
Okay. Always dangerous.
To secure the sorts of reforms achieved in the 20th century by advocates of regulated capitalism, socialism, and communism requires doing more, going further than reformers anywhere understood.
Right. That's my point. I think that if we take our own country as an example, we did extraordinary things in the 1930s in the face of a crisis even worse than the one we're in now. We're now talking about making less Social Security. Yeah. People have to remember, in the depths of the Depression is when we created Social Security. When everyone said there's no money to do such things, as they're saying it now, Roosevelt came in, creates a Social Security system, creates an unemployment compensation system, creates a federal employment program that filled 12.5 million jobs between 1934 and 1941. All the things that we're told today.
What got everybody back to work.
Finally, but a lot was done even before. My point is, everything that was done is now in the process of being undone, if it hasn't already been. We had the spectacle this morning in the newspaper that just blew me away. Sanford Weill, former head of Citibank, announcing that in his mind, we ought to separate depository banking from investment banking. We did that after the Great Depression, called the Glass-Steagall Act, that made that separation. And Sanford Weill, as chairman of Citibank, was the leading banker that got that repealed with the repeal signed by Bill Clinton. And he now says, ooh, and scratching my head, wow, man, probably shouldn't have done that.
And that is interesting and is actually true. And people are asking perhaps some of the things that they believe might not necessarily be modified. And especially after some of the things that have happened since Dodd-Frank and other legislation, people saying, well, was that enough? And should we do more? And did it give some incentive on the part of people in Congress to look at the regulations and say, should we move deeper and further? I should say that Richard Wolff's book is called Occupy the Economy, Challenging Capitalism, a series of conversations with David Barsamian. And David Harvey's book is called Rebel Cities, From the Right to the City to the Urban Revolution. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.